In 1876, Black Americans stood at a moment that felt like the beginning of real freedom. Because for the first time in the nation's history, formerly enslaved people were voting, holding political office, and receiving protection from the federal government. Many believed that the promises made after the Civil War were finally being honored, and that equality, though fragile, was slowly becoming real. What almost no one knew at the time was that their future was about to be decided without them. Behind closed doors, in a political deal where black lives were treated as a bargaining chip rather than as citizens worthy of protection. This is not a story about ballots being stolen in the streets, but about power being stolen quietly, legally, and deliberately. This is the story of how one election did not just decide a president, but destroyed black political freedom for nearly a century. After the Civil War ended in 1865, the United States entered a period known as Reconstruction, which was meant to rebuild the South and integrate formerly enslaved people into American political life. During this period, the federal government passed constitutional amendments that ended slavery, granted citizenship, and protected voting rights for black men. For a brief and extraordinary moment in American history, black communities experienced political power. Black men served as mayors, legislators, sheriffs, and members of Congress, while federal troops remained in southern states to protect black voters from violence and intimidation. However, Reconstruction was deeply unpopular among white Southern elites, who viewed black political participation as a threat to their social and economic control. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan used terror, lynching, and intimidation to suppress black voters, while Southern politicians demanded the return of white-only rule. By the mid-1870s, many Northern politicians had grown tired of enforcing Reconstruction, not because it had failed, but because protecting black citizens required political courage and constant federal involvement. The presidential election of 1876 took place in this tense and dangerous environment, with Democrat Samuel J. Tilden facing Republican Rutherford B. Hayes. When the votes were counted, Tilden won the popular vote and appeared to have enough electoral votes to win the presidency outright. However, the results from 4 states were disputed, including Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, which were states with large black populations and ongoing racial violence. In these states, black voters were threatened, ballots were destroyed, and election officials openly manipulated results. Both political parties accused each other of fraud, and the country found itself facing an unprecedented constitutional crisis. There was no clear process for resolving such disputes, and many Americans feared that the nation could slide back into civil war. For black Americans, the stakes were terrifyingly clear, because a Republican victory meant continued federal protection, while a Democratic victory meant the end of Reconstruction and the return of white supremacist control. Rather than allow the crisis to be resolved openly, political leaders chose secrecy. Behind closed doors, Republican and Democratic elites negotiated a deal that would later be known as the Compromise of 1877. Under this agreement, Rutherford B. Hayes would be awarded the presidency, even though he lost the popular vote. In return, Republicans agreed to withdraw federal troops from the southern states and effectively end Reconstruction. No black leaders were consulted in this decision, and no black voices were present in the room where the deal was made. The rights and safety of millions of black Americans were traded in exchange for political stability and national unity. When Hayes took office, he followed through on the agreement almost immediately, ordering the removal of federal troops and signaling that the federal government would no longer intervene to protect black citizens in the South. The withdrawal of federal troops changed the South almost overnight. White supremacist governments regained control, black elected officials were forced out through violence or legal manipulation, and black voters were systematically stripped of their rights. New laws were introduced to suppress black voting, including literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses that ensured political power remained exclusively white. Violence became a tool of governance, as lynching and racial terror were used to enforce obedience. Segregation laws, later known as Jim Crow, were implemented across the South, separating black Americans from public life, education, and economic opportunity. This system was not accidental or informal, but legally enforced and openly defended by state governments. The federal government, having chosen political peace over justice, refused to intervene. The consequences of the Compromise of 1877 did not last for a few years, but for generations. From the end of Reconstruction until the civil rights movement of the 1960s, Black Americans were largely excluded from political power, economic opportunity, and legal protection. Entire communities were kept poor, undereducated, and vulnerable to violence, while white politicians built wealth and stability on the absence of black political influence. The racial wealth gap, voter suppression, and deep distrust of government institutions can all be traced back to this moment of deliberate abandonment. This was not simply racism driven by ignorance, but a calculated political decision that prioritized power and comfort over justice and equality. Many people today ask why Black Americans continue to speak about history, injustice, and distrust of political systems. The answer lies in moments like this, where freedom was not gradually lost, but intentionally taken away through policy. The election of 1876 proves that democracy can fail not only through violence, but through compromise, negotiation, and silence. It shows how easily constitutional principles can be ignored when those in power decide that protecting certain citizens is no longer convenient. Understanding this history is not about blaming the past, but about recognizing how deeply its consequences still shape the present. The election of 1876 did not merely choose a president, but redefined the meaning of citizenship in America. It sent a clear message that black freedom was conditional and could be sacrificed when political stability was at risk. Until this story is openly acknowledged, the promise of American democracy remains incomplete. History does not disappear when it is ignored, but instead waits quietly until someone is willing to tell it honestly. Thank you for watching, and subscribe for more stories from America's erased past.